Chapter 268, A Myriad of Complicated Matters in the World. There was a large mountain hanging upside down somewhere in the world. The peak of the mountain pointed at the South Sea. Chen Ping'an sat on the branch of the ancestor osmanthus tree and dazedly gazed at this stunning scene. Ning Yao had set off from here to journey across majestic world. He had heard that southern world continent was the closest continent to Stalactite Mountain, so would Liu Xianyang come here to take a look in the future? Osmanthus Island still needed to travel for approximately half a day before it would truly enter the territory of Stalactite Mountain. All kinds of ships came and went around them, and there were giant turtles with stone tablets on their backs, clams with crystalline and translucent shells drifting on the sea, kun ships that were even larger than that owned by Ceremony Mountains slowly descending, a collection of iridescent clouds bringing with them countless oriental magpies, rows of immortal cranes and azure birds tugging along a tall building, and so on. Osmanthus Island didn't seem the least bit out of place among them. Chen Ping'an suddenly turned around and looked down. He saw that young girl again, her figure lithe, her appearance beautiful, a pearl hairpin in her hair, a dress on her body, and a colorful ribbon around her waist. However, Chen Ping'an's skin was crawling, and he felt extremely uneasy. In fact, this feeling was even more intense and direct than when he had seen Liu Chicheng dressed in pink Taoist robes in front of the rundown temple back then. This was because Chen Ping'an could see this beautiful girl's Adam's apple. He didn't detest this, but he was indeed very unaccustomed to it. Chen Ping'an suddenly scratched his head and stared directly at the man who liked to dress like a woman. The uneasiness in his heart vanished, transforming instead into a hint of nostalgia. Back when he was an apprentice in the dragon kiln, Chen Ping'an had been acquainted with a man whom others always ridiculed as a sissy. That man was timid, and he had walked in a very feminine manner. When speaking, he had also liked to throw flirtatious glances and make orchid-shaped fingers. In the dragon kiln managed by Old Man Yao, this man had naturally faced the most discrimination. If he finally saved enough money to buy a pair of new shoes, it was guaranteed that they would be stepped on and dirtied by the other kiln workers on the same day. However, he wouldn't dare to say anything, and he would simply suffer in silence. Logically speaking, both he and Chen Ping'an should have sympathized with each other, given that Chen Ping'an was also discriminated against in the dragon kiln. Strangely, however, the man who always sobbed and cried would immediately become very brave in front of Chen Ping'an. He would always taunt Chen Ping'an and speak to the young boy in a very unpleasant manner. However, Chen Ping'an had never paid any heed to him. On quite a few occasions, the man had been caught by Liu Xianyang, Old Man Yao's official disciple, while taunting Chen Ping'an. Liu Xianyang had directly slapped him and sent him spinning on the spot, causing him to immediately shut up and behave. Afterward, the man would secretly bring some snacks and desserts to Liu Xianyang's room, wrapping them up in a manner even more exquisite than shop attendants. He had most likely been apologizing to, and perhaps sucking up to Liu Xianyang, someone who was destined to become the future manager of the dragon kiln. The paper cuttings decorating the windows in the dragon kiln had also been made by him. He had endured many late nights by himself to create these, and even the women in the streets and alleys would feel that their works were inferior. If this person were genuinely a woman, just how brilliant would his needlework be? Chen Ping'an had naturally detested the barb-tongued sissy back then. However, he had also been afraid of severely wounding the man in a single punch if he were unable to hold back. At that time, the young boy had already traversed all of the mountains and rivers surrounding the small town with Old Man Yao. Chopping wood and burning charcoal had also become extremely familiar tasks. Not only that, but he had also practiced breathing techniques taught to him by Old Man Yang since very early on. As such, his strength had already been equivalent to, if not greater than, strong young men. In the end, the feminine man had made a huge mistake when guarding the night one time. He had unexpectedly extinguished the flames in a dragon kiln. Terrified by this, he had fled during the night. Having some smarts, he hadn't dared to run toward the small town, and he had instead fled deep into the mountains and forests. If such grave mistakes were committed in some shop in the market, it would be a mistake severe enough to warrant death. Upon learning of this, Old Man Yao had immediately sent dozens of strong young men after that bastard with a dark expression. Chen Ping'an, who was extremely familiar with the mountain paths, was naturally part of the group. 2 days later, the feminine man had been tied up and marched back to the dragon kiln. Old Man Yao had then immediately broken his hands and legs, beating him so severely that his flesh had been mangled and his bones had been revealed. The group of men who had found him was the group that he always flattered the most. No one had felt any sympathy for this feminine man who had caused such a huge disaster. Even if they had, they wouldn't have dared to show it on their faces. After all, Old Man Yao had almost never been this angry before. Before having his arms and legs broken, the feminine man had already wet his pants in fright. Afterward, he had shaken uncontrollably upon being forced to lie on the ground. When the beating started, he had screamed hysterically with tears and snot streaming down his face. As the beating continued, the feminine man had been like a fish being cut alive on a chopping board. The feminine man was indeed a sissy, after all, and he had never shown an ounce of manliness and backbone from the beginning to the end, all the way until he finally fainted. In the end, the feminine man had surprisingly survived the merciless beating. He had stubbornly lived on, laying on a sickbed for almost half a year to recuperate. During this time, many apprentices in the dragon kiln had taken turns looking after him, with Chen Ping'an naturally being no exception. However, many people had been dissatisfied with this difficult task, so they had sought out Chen Ping'an and asked him to take their place, what with Chen Ping'an being the most agreeable person in the dragon kiln. In the end, it was actually the young boy whom the feminine man disliked the most who had wound up looking after him the most. The two of them had refused to engage in any conversation with each other, highlighting the mutual dislike between them. Chen Ping'an had simply gathered ingredients and cooked medicine for him every day, while the feminine man had occasionally become adrift and dazedly stared at the old paper, cutting on the window that was losing their color after being punished by the wind and rain. Perhaps he had been dreaming of a day when he could finally leave the bed again. At that time, he would definitely find some spare time between work to replace this paper cutting with a beautiful and brand new paper cutting that was a brilliant red color. However, the bedridden feminine man who had survived his severe beating and gritted his teeth to return from the brink of death had still ultimately died. He had been killed by a single comment. That had been a casual comment by a kiln worker. Chen Ping'an had been cooking medicine by the door at that time, with his back facing the kiln worker and the feminine man. The former had chuckled and remarked that during the day of the beating when the feminine man's clothes were torn to shreds, his pale bottom had truly looked like that of a woman. Chen Ping'an hadn't felt like this comment was extremely inappropriate. After all, the men in the dragon kiln had taunted the feminine man with much more vicious comments than this before. Moreover, the feminine man had almost never argued with other people, most likely because he didn't dare to. Indeed, the most he would do was probably curse them behind their back, saying something like, "You dare to taunt me? Do you want me to blow up the graves of your ancestors?" However, it was after hearing this seemingly mundane comment that the feminine man, who could already sit up by himself, had surprisingly chatted a lot with Chen Ping'an on that day. It had mostly been him speaking, while the taciturn young boy had quietly listened. When talking about paper cutting, Chen Ping'an had sincerely praised his skills and remarked on the beauty of his work. The feminine man had smiled upon hearing this. On that night, the feminine man, whose courage was even tinier than that of a needle's eye, had unexpectedly used a pair of scissors to stab himself in the throat. Not only that, but he hadn't forgotten to cover himself with a blanket, preventing those who entered his room from immediately seeing his final posture of death. In fact, no one had dared to collect his corpse and bring it out of the room. Truly, the scene was far too inauspicious. Fortunately, Chen Ping'an was already accustomed to death befalling those around him, so he hadn't paid much heed to the inauspicious nature of the situation. In the end, he had dragged Liu Xianyang around with him and busily sorted out the mess. He hadn't felt especially sad during this time, nor had he obtained any kind of enlightenment. Only when wakekeeping had Chen Ping'an sat by himself in an empty and eerie morning hall. He hadn't felt any fear, and he had sat beside the stove and murmured, "Since you didn't like being a man in this life, then you should reincarnate into a woman in your next life. In fact, during their idle chatter on that fateful day, the feminine man had asked Chen Ping'an why he had let him go even though he had been the first one to find him. Not only that, but the young boy had even pointed out a small path leading deeper into the mountains. Chen Ping'an had replied that he was afraid of old man Yao beating the feminine man to death if he were caught. At that time, with the feminine man's sesame-sized courage, he would only dare to exact revenge on him and not anyone else. The feminine man had smiled very happily upon hearing this. Thinking back to it now, the feminine man's smile had, in fact, been fairly ugly. However, the young boy genuinely didn't feel any disgust toward it. The lithe and radiantly beautiful young girl standing under the osmanthus tree was already seething with rage. To have someone so boldly stare at her, or more precisely, him, like this. If he weren't afraid of damaging the osmanthus tree and causing unnecessary trouble, he would have immediately summoned his 2 bonded flying swords to stab this lecherous bastard to death. Chen Ping'an came to his senses and also realized his unintentional act of rudeness. He cupped his fists and said apologetically, "I'm sorry, I was a bit distracted just then." The young man narrowed his peach blossom eyes, seemingly filled with the colors and radiance of spring. He then brought his index finger and middle finger together and made a stabbing motion at Chen Ping'an before wagging them slightly back and forth. His action was as provocative as could be. Instead of keeping his head turned, Chen Ping'an decided to directly turn his entire body around. He patted the empty space beside him on the tall branch and chuckled. "As an apology, I'll allow you to sit here and enjoy the view of Stalactite Mountain on Lady Gui's behalf." The young man clasped his hands behind his back and looked up with his face delicate and tender as the spring breeze. He smiled and asked, "Do you like men? Or do you like both men and women as long as they're beautiful enough?" Chen Ping'an could feel a headache forming, and he vigorously shook his head to express his innocence. He naturally liked females only. In fact, he only liked a single girl. Standing under the osmanthus tree, 2 wisps of sword chi materialized near the clasped hands of the young man, 1 gold and 1 silver. They were extremely subtle and almost invisible to the naked eye. It was clear that he was going to use his flying swords to kill if a disagreement arose between them. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before smiling and saying this might anger you even more, but you look very good in this kind of outfit. Chen Ping'an rested his hands on the branch and added with limpid eyes, "I say this from the bottom of my heart." The young man cross-dressing as a woman furrowed his brows. He silently walked away. However, he didn't leave the mountain peak, and he simply walked near the railing of the observation deck and gazed into the distance. Chen Ping'an leaped down from the tall branch and shouted at the young man whose back was facing him, "I'm leaving now. If you want to enjoy the view from the top of the osmanthus tree, then it's best that you seize this opportunity when there are fewer people. Otherwise, Lady Gui might become unhappy." The young man didn't respond. Only when Chen Ping'an was far away did he turn around to glance at the osmanthus tree. After hesitating for a long time, he eventually decided against climbing up the tree to gaze at Stalactite Mountain from a higher vantage point. As for the 2 wisps of sword chi, he had already retracted them into the colorful ribbon around his waist a long time ago. In fact, those 2 wisps of sword chi weren't sword chi at all. Rather, they were seemingly unremarkable flying swords that were actually extremely high-grade bonded flying swords. Their names were Needle Tip and Wheat On. He had been born with them. He was a genuine, innate sword talent. Moreover, to be born with 2 bonded flying swords was a chance smaller than 1 in 10,000 for sword cultivators. The keyword wasn't one, but smaller. Most importantly, the quality of his flying swords was absolutely terrifying. Thus, his master had stated that his aptitude would definitely allow him to reach the upper 5 tiers. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken him as a disciple. As for exactly how many years it would take him to advance to the unpolished jade tier, his master hadn't made any mention of this, and he hadn't asked about it either. He had no interest in learning about this. Indeed, he was more fascinated and obsessed with divination techniques pertaining to the Great Tao. However, It was a shame that his master had said that he couldn't make it very far on this path, and that he couldn't inherit his master's lineage through this. Including his master, all of his senior brothers and junior brothers encouraged him to practice the sword. In reality, he was well aware of the fact that they weren't sincerely hoping for his sword Dao to truly reach the peak and become dominant. Instead, they harbored ill intentions, and they wanted to see him fail and make a joke of himself. The reason for this was very simple. He was afraid of heights. A sword cultivator who was afraid of heights. Just what kind of joke was this? When he occasionally stepped on his sword to ride on the wind, he would never rise more than 6 meters from the ground. The young man glanced at the branch which the young boy had sat on just then, and he felt like he himself was also an utter idiot. Chen Ping'an returned to the Gimai courtyard. Ma Zhai, the golden core tier sword cultivator, was already standing inside and waiting for him with a smile. A while back, Chen Ping'an had decided to visit the courtyard where Ma Zhai was resting and recuperating, asking him when they could continue to practice the sword. 3 days later, the Gimai courtyard had returned to the same way as before. Ma Zhai practiced sword techniques with Chen Ping'an, while Jin Su was responsible for their 3 meals a day. Lady Gui would occasionally visit the small courtyard, and she wouldn't disturb Chen Ping'an or Ma Zhai. She would quietly sit there for a while and at most make a pot of tea for the two of them. One time, Chen Ping'an had retrieved the talisman paper where the female skeletal ghost was kept. Holding the paper talisman in her hand, Lady Gui had quickly shaken the skeletal ghost out and allowed her to finally see the light of day again. However, the female ghost in white, who had been extremely aggressive in the city god temple in colorful Garment Nation, was immediately greeted by the nascent tier Lady Gui, the old boatman who had fallen from the golden core tier, as well as her enemy, Chen Ping'an. If she weren't already dead, she would have definitely been scared to death. In the end, with the help of Lady Gui, who was the pseudo-sage of Osmanthus Island, the beautiful skeletal ghost made an oath to loyally serve Chen Ping'an for 60 years. In return, she could leave the talisman paper where her soul would slowly fade away if spiritual energy wasn't funneled inside. She was allowed to stay inside Chen Ping'an's locust wood sword case instead. Because locust trees had been referred to as locust residences, since ancient times, it wasn't just grass spirits and wood spirits that were especially fond of locust trees that were over 1,000 years old. Ghosts and yin entities were also extremely fond of them. As they neared Stalactite Mountain, there was one starry night when the old boatman suddenly visited Chen Ping'an and brought him to the dock at the foot of the mountain on Osmanthus Island. When Chen Ping'an arrived, he discovered a young flood dragon lying on the dock with its head resting on the shore and more than half of its body still in the sea. Gazing at Chen Ping'an, its eyes were filled with childish curiosity and gratitude. The old boatman squatted beside the shore and clicked his tongue in wonder, remarking, "In terms of human age, this pitiful little creature is only equivalent to 6 or 7 years old." Lady Gui was unwilling to make things difficult for this innocent little creature at the time, so she only took the Dragon King basket and set the little flood dragon free. Unexpectedly, however, it seems like it has no home to return to, so it quickly caught up to Osmanthus Island again. However, it didn't dare to get too close, so it continued to whimper every night as it circled around Osmanthus Island and refused to leave. Now that we're getting closer and closer to Stalactite Mountain, the little flood dragon most likely understands that it will face certain death if it follows Osmanthus Island forward. So, it whimpers loudly even during the day. If it weren't for Lady Gui taking pity on it and helping it conceal its aura, I'm afraid it would have been skinned alive and killed by those chi refiners from the mountains who still have lingering anger in their hearts. In the end, the old boatman smiled and said, "Chen Ping'an, it seems like the little flood dragon has especially come here to look for you. However, I'm unsure about whether it wants to thank you or exact revenge on you. Even though it's still very young, flood dragons and their kin are known for their cold-bloodedness and sly nature. So, this is quite hard to say." Chen Ping'an didn't say anything. He simply took out an ordinary snake gall pebble and tossed it to the young flood dragon. The young flood dragon instinctively wolfed it down with a rather confused look in its eyes. Chen Ping'an had then waved his hands and gestured for the young flood dragon to leave. After turning around and returning to the sea, the young flood dragon whimpered softly, still unwilling to leave the vicinity of Osmanthus Island. After pondering for a moment, Chen Ping'an had surprisingly tossed a large handful of ordinary snake gall pebbles into the sea. The young flood dragon vigorously twisted and turned in the sea, creating huge waves as it swallowed the incredible delicacies one by one. Afterward, Chen Ping'an stood on the dock and said to the young flood dragon, "Remember to cultivate earnestly in the future. You've accepted my favor today, so I'll smash you to death with a single punch if you end up finding joy in harming others like that elder of yours." Upon hearing this, the young flood dragon swam back to the dock and raised its head above the shore. It opened its eyes wide, as if trying to burn Chen Ping'an's appearance into its memory. After a brief moment, it then leaned back and returned to the vast sea. The old boatman had experienced all kinds of things before, and he sighed with emotion. "You have a kind heart, and you planted a seed of positive karma. However, the world is unpredictable, and seeds of positive karma will not necessarily grow into fruits of positive outcome." With an apathetic expression on his face, Chen Ping'an gazed at the sea upon which the specks of stars were glittering like gold and silver, saying softly, "If it transforms into negative karma, then I'll draw my sword and eliminate it with a single slash." At that time, the old boatman was thinking about his master, who was going to vanish for heaven knows how many years again. He was also thinking about that golden text left behind by an immortal that Chen Ping'an had helped deliver to him. Because of this, he didn't pay much attention to Chen Ping'an's expression and words. In Great Sway Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, the young classmates who had left the Great Li Empire together were destined to no longer spend all their time together after arriving in this academy. Indeed, Li Hua had already made 2 new friends, a cowardly child from a powerful clan in the capital and an extremely courageous rascal from a poor family. They were both slightly older than Li Hua, and the 3 of them would always play together and go crazy. They enjoyed themselves immensely. Meanwhile, Lin Xiaoyi was now obsessed with cultivation, and he would always travel between the scripture library, his dormitory, and the classrooms. He read all the books he could, and he stood out from the crowd. Yulu had a close relationship with Prince Gao Xuan from Great Sway Nation, and the 2 of them eventually became good friends. Gao Xuan became increasingly fond of visiting the academy to fish with Yulu. Apart from attending classes, Zai Zai seldom ventured out of her dormitory. She willingly acted as a maidservant for Qi Dongshan. After Li Baoping read another letter from her junior uncle, the little girl appeared to be downcast for a very long time. On this day, she skipped class again and was as agile as a small cat as she nimbly climbed atop the large tree located on the peak of the East Mountain. She sat on a branch and leaned on the tree trunk. Her self-crafted wooden badge with the characters Alliance Leader of the Martial Arts World was hanging around her neck, and she had engraved the characters, "Commands all lords afterward," because she had felt like the badge still wasn't impressive enough. Afterward, she hadn't been able to stop herself from engraving more and more impressive phrases onto the wooden badge. These were all grand phrases from the cultivation world that she had copied from the storybooks. For example, "Invincible, I lament the lack of rivals in my life," and so on. A spirited and handsome young boy in white stood on a branch beside her. He gently bounced up and down with the movement of the branch, and there was a smile on his face as he asked, "What's wrong? Are you angry about something?" With the arrival of summer, the little girl was now wearing a red shirt and a long red skirt instead of a thick red jacket. "I'm not angry," she replied in a sullen voice. "Do you feel like Li Hua, Lin Xiaoyi, and the others are growing more and more distant from you?" Qi Dongshan asked. "It doesn't matter if they grow more distant from me," the little girl huffed in reply. "After all, I never liked interacting with them even when we went to school together in the small town." "Then you're unhappy about the injustice that my teacher is facing?" Qi Dongshan asked with a knowing smile. The little girl was a straightforward person, and she nodded boldly and acknowledged this. Qi Dongshan rested his hands behind his head and said with emotion, "Everyone grows up, and growing up will inevitably cause one to pick up some new things and discard some old things. In this process of picking things up and discarding things, in the blink of an eye, one quickly grows old. They're even willing to discard junior uncle. The little girl fumed. Kui Dongshin turned around to look at the furious little girl. He smiled faintly and replied, "Why wouldn't they be willing to? In any case, my teacher won't become angry even if he learns of this. That being the case, what are you getting all worked up for? There's absolutely no need." The little girl angrily crossed her arms. Kui Dongshin turned back around to gaze at the capital of Great Sway Nation. In the future, you might become very good friends with someone, and the two of you will share many intimate conversations together as you grow up. However, she might get married one day, and she'll eventually like her husband more than you. You might also come across a teacher who's even better than Chi Jingchun, and you might one day feel that Mr. Chi's knowledge wasn't the most profound in the world. One day in the future, you might also encounter an impressive young boy who's even better than your junior uncle. At that time, you'll discover that your current worry and sadness is only temporary and nothing very important. You'll drink 1 or 2 sips of wine, and all of this worry and sadness will flow away just like that. Kui Dongshin suddenly turned around and exclaimed in astonishment, "Little Baoping, you actually didn't offer a retort. If you don't say something, then I'll run out of things to say." The little girl scrunched up her pretty little face and replied, "I'm busy feeling sad." Kui Dongshin chortled with laughter as he fell back and coincidentally lay sideways on a thin branch. He held his head up with a single hand and gazed at the little girl in red. One day in the future, this little girl would grow taller and taller, and her round little face would also become skinnier and sharper. Her eyes might still be as watery as always, and they might still be pure and filled with energy. She might still be dressed in red, and she might ride a horse along the river banks and drink wine in the mountains. However, she would probably come across joyful events and sad events as well, right? Kui Dongshin heaved a faint sigh. He felt slightly anxious. If such a good girl genuinely ended up liking his teacher, that would indeed be a very worrisome thing. If one day she unexpectedly didn't like his teacher anymore, that might be an even more disappointing thing. Kui Dongshin turned his body and closed his eyes. He then crossed his legs and went asleep. As for those chance encounters and diverging relationships, Kui Dongshin was thoroughly aware of them even though his body was young. After all, those experiences and challenges were all accumulated in his heart. His awareness of them was no inferior to that of the Great Li Empire's imperial preceptor, Kui Chan. There was one thing that he hadn't told the little girl. He, Kui Dongshin, as well as the old Kui Chan, Zhu Yu, Mao Jiaodong, and the others, including Chi Jingchun, had all enjoyed shade under the old scholar in the past. They had slowly grown up, and in the end, they had all hoped to walk out from that incredibly large patch of shade. Those who succeeded continued on their way. Those who failed, however, saw their hearts slowly change. The little girl nearby put her wooden badge away and carefully retrieved a painting from her clothes. It was a painting of Chen Ping'an standing under an osmanthus tree and smiling at her. Her worries were immediately washed away, and a smile stretched across her face as she happily said, "Junior uncle truly looks so handsome after learning to drink. When I grow older, I'm definitely going to adventure around the cultivation world with junior uncle." Li Baoping became more and more excited thinking about this, and she turned around and asked loudly, "Kui Dongshin, is it difficult to drink?" "You're not allowed to drink," Kui Dongshin replied resolutely. "Why not?" Li Baoping fumed. "Teacher isn't willing to scold you at all, but he'll directly beat me to death," Kui Dongshin replied in a sulky voice. Li Baoping sighed and shook her head, saying in pity, "How pitiful." Kui Dongshin stole a glance at the little girl who had a beaming smile on her face. "Little Baoping, please hide your smile of pleasure away when trying to console others in the future." Li Baoping feigned grabbing a seal and stamping it down. Kui Dongshin sighed in grief and muttered, "My good intentions are repaid with ungratefulness." Between Stalactite Mountain and the vast sea, there were numerous paths that hovered in midair like ribbons of clouds and water. These were paths that allowed intercontinental ships to arrive at the mountain. In fact, the many intercontinental ships that could fly through the air also had to descend to the sea and take these paths. They weren't allowed to directly approach Stalactite Mountain. Osmanthus Island momentarily stopped at a dock located beneath one such path. After symbolically handing over a document similar to a clearance document, they were exempt from paying the astronomical toll usually required. The island started to drift towards Stalactite Mountain, following the angled river path. Stalactite Mountain measured 50 kilometers in radius. However, as a lone mountain above the sea, it controlled a vast region around the mountain. A tall and sturdy Taoist with the appearance of a middle-aged man stood atop some cliff face. There was a skinny old Taoist priest with the demeanor of a transcendent being standing behind him with a fly whisk in hand, and all of the strands of the fly whisk were golden and silver whiskers of flood dragons. "Teacher, do you need this student to take action and destroy Osmanthus Island?" the old Taoist priest asked in a quiet voice. "I agreed to the bet, so I'm willing to accept the loss. There's nothing embarrassing about this. I'm not your grandteacher, after all, someone who hasn't suffered a single defeat in his life," the tall and sturdy Taoist replied with a smile. While the great heavenly lord in Stalactite Mountain spoke, a Taoist priest was smashed into the mortal world from the heavens beyond heavens, in the heavenly world, with a single punch.